Hello, welcome to Critical Conversations, Coastal Community Resilience and Adaptation to Flooding. My name is Juno Blue, and I'll be responsible for hosting this session. The session chair is Michael Paoliso, and he will lead today's session. Before we get started, please note that in this webinar format, all participant audio and video is disabled. We ask that you please hold questions or comments till the guided section at the end. Please use your raise hand feature and I will unmute you, trying to best keep track of the order. You can find and turn on captions at the bottom of your Zoom screen. After the meeting, participants will be able to engage with the session chair and speakers on the Hoover Meetup channel. Thank you again for attending today's session. Michael Paoliso will now introduce the first speaker of the session.
Thank you, Juno, for getting us going and for volunteering to be a moderator in our session today. I'm Michael Paoliso. I'm one of the co-chairs along with Cindy Grace McCaskey, and I welcome you all to our session today on critical conversations on coastal community resilience and adaptation to flooding. Before we begin, I want to give you a visual introduction to me. I am a white male. I have brown hair. I'm wearing dark rimmed glasses. I have a light green shirt on. I'm sitting at home in my study in a coastal community nearby, in front of my bookshelf, and this is my first time ever attending a virtual meeting. I'm also the president-elect of the Society for Applied Anthropology and have been involved in developing these meetings. So this is our first session that I've been in, so I'm going to admit I'm very nervous about doing all of this. So welcome everyone. I'm going to start us off and then pass it to Cindy, who will walk us through the session a little more and introduce and the others. I wanted to start us off by saying, explaining a little bit about critical conversations at annual meetings. At our annual meetings, we typically have a number of critical conversations. Critical conversations are sessions, topics that have been identified by the SFAA board and the program committee for the annual meeting, that topics that they feel are critical and they want to have a discussion on. And coastal flooding is one of these topics that the board and the program committee decided that we wanted to have a session on. We have two other critical conversations at the meeting. There's one following later today on the history of African American descendants and engagement. And then the second one on Thursday, which is an after review of the 2020 census. So these critical conversations cover different topics. More specifically, every annual meeting has a program committee. Every program committee has a local subcommittee. And typically, we would be on site someplace. We would have been on site in Norfolk, Virginia this year. The program committee put together a subcommittee. Both Cindy and I were on that subcommittee, local committee, and we picked up the topic, this critical conversation topic of coastal community resilience. So a little bit of an explanation of how this particular topic and how both of us became involved in it, and then we recruited our colleagues here. To wrap up my brief introduction here, by local, traditionally at our annual meetings, local is just not the immediate city which is hosting us, but a broader region. And for this meeting, we're covering the Tidewater region, particularly from North Carolina up to at least Maryland, kind of the northern, southern Atlantic to the mid-Atlantic. So I'm going to pass it over to Cindy, but I do want to say that We have not scheduled a Hoover follow-up for this meeting, although it is available. I believe it's still on the schedule, so if people do go there, we will be happy to show up and participate. So now I'm going to pass it over to Cindy to tell us a little bit more about this session and our colleagues.
All right, thank you, Michael. And thanks everyone for joining us today. I am going to save my personal introduction till a little bit later with in terms of my background in research, but just to tell you a little bit about me, my pronouns are she and her. I'm a white woman with brown hair. I have a black short sleeve shirt on with a silver necklace. And I'm sitting in the spare room of my house at home with a bed behind me and a bookshelf. So, all right, to get us started, talking about the topic for today is Wee Yusuf from Old Dominion University. And I will pass it over to you, Wee.
Thank you so much, Cindy. If we could go to the next slide. Welcome, everyone. My name is Wee Yusuf. Actually, the first slide will be fine. Or more. That's okay.
There's probably a little bit of a delay.
Yes.
There we go.
Thank you. My name is Wee Yusuf, and I am a professor in the School of Public Service here at Old Dominion University. And I think consistent with the Norfolk theme, ODU's main campus is in the heart of the city of Norfolk, but we also have several centers located across what is called the Hampton Roads region here in southeastern coastal Virginia. And I'm also the assistant director for our Institute for Coastal Adaptation and Resilience, which is a really fun position to be in, given that in our particular region, we have 17 localities all trying to do very different things and very cool things in the realm of coastal adaptation and resilience. So it's very nice to have these 17 localities in our backyard that we can work with to think about how do we address issues of coastal adaptation and resilience, not just here in Hampton Roads, but with applications to communities beyond the local area. I also have a different hat in that I'm also the program lead for a joint program between ODU and Virginia Sea Grant. So ODU hosts the Virginia Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program. And as the program lead for the Virginia Climate Adaptation and Resilience Program, one of the other fun things that I get to do is engage with community members and work with localities in their efforts to undertake programming and planning efforts to address coastal resilience. So a lot of these issues that I deal with on a daily basis really picks up on kind of multiple themes, but related to the approach of thinking about whole of community and multi-sectoral approaches for addressing coastal resilience as a wicked problem. Cindy, if we could go to the next slide. So my research centers on coastal flooding and sea level rise, particularly as critical coastal resilience issues that are characterized as wicked problems. So when we think about these coastal resilience issues like flooding, sea level rise, first and foremost, kind of given where I stand as a policy scholar, it involves changing behavior. We're talking about institutional behavioral change in terms of policies and solutions, but we're also talking about individual residents changing their behavior and maybe better understanding their vulnerability and their risks. We're also talking about problems and solutions that span organizational and jurisdictional boundaries. And you'll probably hear me say it several times today, the water doesn't respect jurisdictional or political boundaries. And so when we think about the problem, we think about the solution, that organizational and that boundary spanning, I think, offers opportunities, but it can also pose significant challenges. But as a wicked problem, it's also socially complex. We don't talk about flooding as an isolated problem. One of the issues that we're currently working in terms of our research is in the city of Portsmouth here in Hampton Roads, When we're talking about flooding, we're talking about school children losing out on educational time because they can't get to school on time because the roads are flooded. We're also talking about lost productivity and lost wages when people might have to lose shifts or get to work late because, again, they're not able to get to work on time. So it's a socially complex problems that might be rooted in something that is environmental or within the built environment, but has ripple effects on social and the economic structure. So in particular, then, my research really takes a behavioral lens to analyzing coastal resilience, thinking about problems like how do we get residents to engage in the topic, in the discussion and deliberation about adaptation? What are people willing to do? What kind of information do they need? How much are they willing to pay? Sometimes when we talk about coastal adaptation solutions, we're not talking about simple solutions. Sometimes there might be millions of dollars of investments that are required. What are people willing to pay? And what challenges do people make in making their own adaptation solutions or deciding on their own adaptation solutions? Cindy, next slide. So quick final thoughts is really that my research really focuses on this whole of community. So we need government, we need businesses, we need nonprofits and community organizations, and we need members of civil society, residents themselves, to be engaged in adaptation and resilience. Each group of actors, each sector plays complementary roles, but sometimes also supplemental and redundant roles that are critical for ensuring that when we talk about coastal adaptation and resilience, it's in a much more holistic way. But more importantly, that research is people-centered. It puts people at the center of understanding the problem and puts people at the center of understanding how might we potentially address the issues. So understanding of the problem and the solution, understanding people and their willingness to take action, their willingness to pay, but also something that we don't always talk about is the perceived efficacy of people. And how do residents think that they can actually be part of the solution? How can they actually think that they actually have what it takes to be more resilient or to adapt? And so when I think about coastal resilience as a wicked problem, it needs wickedly good solutions that are rooted in this whole of community and multi-sectoral approach, but that are also very people-centered and put people at the center of deliberation, of discussion, and decision-making. So that's just a few quick snapshots about me. Thank you for being here.
Okay, thank you very much, Wee. And I apologize if I didn't say this. I can't remember if Michael did, but we're going to go through just some brief introductions of all of our panelists, and then we have some guiding discussion questions, which will then open it up for Q&A, and we're really hoping that to be the bulk of this session, more question and answer and open discussion. All right, so next we have Cindy Paoliso.
Thanks. And I just realized I didn't even put my name on my slides. So I'm Cindy Paoliso. I am an associate professor at the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science at the Horn Point Laboratory, which is in Cambridge, Maryland. And I'm a scientist. So this is my very first meeting with anthropologists, and I'm super excited to chat with you all. But I do feel a little bit like a fish out of water. But that said, what I've been focusing on a lot lately is trying to think about possible approaches to improve coastal resiliency. And so lately I've been doing a lot of work on living shorelines. And so that's what I'm highlighting in these next few slides. So first of all, there's lots of different definitions out there for living shorelines. So I always start with a definition of what I'm talking about today. And what I mean are created marshes with or without adjacent structures or rocks. And so the kind of middle panel on this slide shows you what that looks like. So it's a bunch of rocks right in front of a marsh that would then go up into a property. And so the reason that they're installed is for shoreline erosion. So shoreline erosion is really rapid, even more so in the Chesapeake region. We know that a lot of our shoreline is also privately owned. So people are making their own decisions about their property, following a lot of the great stuff that we have been studying. But shoreline erosion it's typically thought of as quote unquote bad, because when you erode a shoreline, Well, a property owner is going to think it's bad because they're losing property if their shoreline is eroding, of course. But it also could be supplying sediment to the adjacent water. And so that could be really bad for things like water clarity and or organisms that live on the bottom. So things like submerged aquatic vegetation and oysters that need light in order to survive and also need to not get completely buried to survive. So if you supply a lot of sediment, then maybe it's not so great for those organisms. And so we know that shoreline erosion is likely to increase in the future with sea level rise, with increased storminess and coastal development. And so the overarching goal of my research is to try to figure out how we can protect our shorelines in an ecologically beneficial way. And so the photos at the bottom of the slide show you all the way on the left-hand panel is what an eroding shoreline kind of looks like. It's like a gnarl of tree roots that get exposed, and the water adjacent to it certainly looks a little bit murky. We're probably supplying a lot of sediment to that water. And so what we want to do is move from that situation towards something like the living shoreline, which is now storing a lot of those sediments within the marsh itself. And so it's not necessarily going into the water that's adjacent to that. And the reason that's important, if you follow the arrows, is that we all want waters that we can swim in, that we can fish in, that we can generally recreate in. So the photo on the left is of my nephew happily plunging in the Patapsco River, which, if anyone is familiar with the Chesapeake Bay region, that's not always a great place to swim. And then the other photo is a photo of me and some friends who like to do open water swimming in the Choptank River, which is another tributary of Chesapeake Bay. So lots of people like to frolic in the water, and we want to make it as safe as possible. So next slide, please. So I've been doing a lot of this work with Lori Staver, who's pictured on this slide. She is also at Horn Point Laboratory. And we're really focusing on three key questions. One has to do with the performance of living shorelines. So do they work? Which means, do they reduce erosion? If they don't do that, then a property owner is like not interested at all in any other talk. We want to know about the impacts, specifically with regard to submerged aquatic vegetation, or SAV, and sediment characteristics. And the reason for that is that there are some rules in the permitting regulations that have to do with SAV. And so that's a very topical question for our agency partners that want to know how better to guide property owners and also how better to put together permits. And then also co-benefits. So when you put in a living shoreline, you stop the shoreline erosion, or reduce it is the goal anyway. But you also get other ecological benefits like storing sediments and nutrients in living shorelines and also the adjacent shallow water habitat. So I have logos from all of the pieces that have funded us over the years to do this work. It's a collection of actually federal, state, and private money. So it's a pretty diverse funding portfolio. We have lots of management and outreach partners with the Maryland Departments of the Environment and Natural Resources. We have a practitioner, partner, environmental concern, and a nonprofit, Shore Rivers. I have a link to the bottom, which clearly you're not going to be able to just copy down right now, but maybe we could like get it to you some other way, that if you are interested in hearing a bit longer of a talk on it, if you go to the Horn Point Lab website and Google Bay 101, it should pop up my name and a link to the talk. And then in the box, I have that this is also a key component of the National Science Foundation's Coastlines and People Research Coordination Network that UMCES is leading, to understand and integrate the impacts of environmental change on coastal dynamics and communities. And Michael is a part of that effort as well. And so my point there is just that it's a both and. It's a scientific issue, it's a management issue, it's a permitting and regulation issue. It's a really cross-cutting issue that a lot of people are involved in. So next slide, please. And then I just wanted to leave you with some teasers rather than leave you like hanging on a cliffhanger of all these questions that we have, just to give you a few highlights of things that we found so far. So far with performance, sure enough, living shorelines reduce shoreline erosion, and you in fact gain some property because when they put a shoreline in, they build the shoreline out into the water. So as a property owner, you would observe that as gaining property basically. And if you do nothing, then your shoreline losses continue at or above historical rates. As far as impacts go, we don't find any obvious impact on SAV distributions just so far. We do find changes in the sedimentary environment, but it's pretty site specific. And with co-benefits, we find that we're getting storage of sediments and nutrients in both the shallow water that's adjacent to shorelines, whether or not they have a living shoreline, but also within the created marsh of the living shoreline itself. And so what that means is that you get like an extra bang for your buck if you have both the living shoreline and submerged aquatic vegetation there. Then you're able to really trap a lot of sediment and nutrient because both of those plant communities trap sediment. And so what that means is that current planning and permitting that currently focuses on areas without SAV could be missing an opportunity to protect shorelines and gain co-benefits of living shorelines. And I always have to end with a caveat that not all sediment is bad. We actually do need some sediment to go into the adjacent water so that we can allow our natural and also created marshes to survive in the face of sea level rise. They have to be able to accrete enough sediments to build upwards at the same rate approximately that sea level is rising. And they do that by trapping sediment. And there could also be some additional effects downstream. So we don't want to stop all of the sediment, but what we do want to do is protect our shorelines in a way that's good for the environment and the property owner. And so that's what we've been focusing on. So thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Cindy. And next we have Andrea.
Hi, everyone. My name is Andrea Miraglia. My pronouns are she, hers. And to provide a visual description of myself, I'm a white woman with brown hair with pink streaks at the front. I'm wearing a pinkish turtleneck, which is my go-to fancy outfit. And I'm sitting in a room with white walls. I am a Venezuelan American woman, so both of my parents are Venezuelan. My dad is from Caracas and my mom is from Maracaibo, but I was born in the United States. I grew up for a bit in Boston, in Caracas, and Miami, and then in Maryland. So I'm a person who's always sort of lived in places where water has significantly shaped the lives of the people that live there. And as a result, I've sort of developed a deep appreciation and love for places like the Bay, as you can see in my kayaking picture. And as a person who is really interested in making coastal places and people more resilient. I have my Bachelor's of Science degree from the University of Maryland's Environmental Science and Policy program with a concentration in environmental anthropology. So more natural, but with some sort of social training in my undergrad. And now I'm in my last year of my master's program, also at the University of Maryland in the Marine Estuarine Environmental Sciences program, where I'm advised by Dr. Michael Paoliso, who's also here, and Dr. Isabella Cañiz, who's a political scientist that does work on environmental topics in Latin America. So what is my connection to adaptation and resilience work? During my time as an undergraduate, I took a class with Dr. Jen Schaffer, and it was called Anthropology and Climate Change. And this was both my first anthropology class and my first experience learning about human adaptation and human resilience and climate-induced displacement in places like Kiribati and Shishmaref. And this introduction to coastal climate impacts and adaptation resources and how really disproportionate and inequitable these things can be is what led me to want to pursue going to graduate school and to work on the issue of managed retreat, which is my thesis work topic. So you may be wondering what is managed retreat, and some of you may know, but I'll explain anyways. So managed retreat is an adaptive response to climate impacts such as sea level rise. And the goal is basically to move the people living in really vulnerable areas inland or upland. So allowing marsh to sort of come back in and act as a natural barrier for these coastlines. I chose this topic because vulnerable coastal regions around the world hold a lot, like the largest portion of the global population. And managed retreat is highly controversial, it's poorly understood, and it's really inequitable. So my thesis work aims to better understand this, to better comprehend managed retreat, and to potentially address some of these issues of equity by using broadly ethnographic or qualitative methods and looking at managed retreat through a multi-stakeholder lens on the Lower Eastern Shore of Maryland. And the findings of my research indicate that different coastal stakeholder groups, which include community residents and government representatives and non-governmental organizations, have really different understandings of what managed retreat is, what drives it, what some of the challenges behind it are, what some of the opportunities for it are. And it also shows that building trust, especially with rural coastal communities at the front lines of sea level rise, who have these sort of historic issues of distrust with government and outside entities, is one of these first big steps we have to take for managed retreat discussions to happen. And I also work on a research team that explores the human dimension of marsh restoration technique called thin layer placement, which is basically using sediment to elevate marshlands, typically impacted by climate change. And this is also being done on the lower eastern shore of Maryland on Deal Island. The goal of this work is basically to start thinking about incorporating human dimensions into our marsh restoration approaches, which is not something that happens all that often. And to sort of refocus our approaches to resilience from just environmental benefits to also include human benefits, to make our coastal people and coastal marshes more resilient. And yeah, I guess outside of these projects, I'm broadly interested in coastal climate adaptation, in using science to serve those most impacted by climate impacts, in building socioecological resilience on coasts, and especially in the use of more multi-stakeholder and sort of collaborative approaches to addressing issues of resilience and adaptation with a focus of equity. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you, Andrea. Next we have Elizabeth Vandola.
Thanks so much. Hi, everybody. I'm Liz. I am a postdoc at the University of Maryland in the Department of Anthropology, and my pronouns are she and her. For the visually impaired, I'm a white woman with shoulder-length brown hair, and I'm wearing a blouse today that has black dots. I'm sitting in my home office, which has light gray walls, and there's a wooden wardrobe behind me. I want to thank the organizers for, one, putting this session together, but also inviting me to be a part of this critical conversation on coastal community resilience and adaptation to flooding, which has been the focus of my work for at least the last 5 years. I've been working in the Chesapeake Bay region for the last 15 years, and more recently have gotten involved in work to increase coastal resilience to climate change, primarily out on the eastern shore of Maryland. Cindy, if you could advance the slide once. So I have a map here that shows you, of course, my highlight. It was transparent on my slide, and here it's solid, but it shows you generally where the eastern shore is relative to Norfolk, which is down at the mouth of the Chesapeake, and so eastern shore, and the other yellow star you see on the map that's over top of the blue section is where the Deal Island Peninsula is. Sorry, you can't actually see it, but it's there under that blue blob. And this is where I've been primarily doing my work over the last 5 years or so. So if you could advance one more. Thanks. So over the, I got involved in coastal resilience work as a PhD student working as part of the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership, which we also refer to as DIP. DIP is a collaborative of residents, faith leaders, scientists, and decision makers who are interested in enhancing the resilience of Deal Island's communities and marshes. And this is a project that began in 2012. It was actually established by Dr. Paoliso, along with several others. And the goal has been always to test how to use different collaborative strategies. In particular, we're interested in collaborative science and collaborative learning to increase support in these rural underserved coastal regions. In particular, we're interested in how these mechanisms can be used to increase knowledge exchange between diverse stakeholders, how it can be used to increase resource channels to these underserved areas like Deal Island, and ultimately how it can help facilitate decision-making that finds a better balance between meeting both human and environmental adaptation needs. I did my dissertation research as part of are looking at a project that DIP carried out called the Integrated Coastal Resiliency Assessment. This was done between 2016 and 2018. And as part of this work, I was specifically interested in how watermen that are part of this collaborative draw upon heritage narratives to engage in discussions about coastal vulnerability, and ultimately how these heritage narratives get used to shape adaptation planning, and how they help to shape some of the projects that we came up with as part of this vulnerability assessment. And since 2018, I've been working as a postdoc coordinating the DIP, and also helping to lead several different research projects as one of DIP's social scientists, including the work that Andrea just mentioned with the human dimensions of marsh restoration projects. Within the last year, though, I've also gotten more involved with working alongside Maryland Department of Natural Resources, Chesapeake and Coastal Services, to help them launch 2 new coastal initiatives for the broader Eastern Shore. And if you could advance one more time. So the first project is helping to roll out this new flood documentation tool called My Coast Maryland. My Coast is a crowdsourced app and website which allows users to upload photos that they've taken of flooding or storm damage that they've experienced on their property, that they've noticed on nearby roadways or in their neighborhood. And when you upload a photo to the platform, it actually links your photo to nearby tide stations and stream gauges, as well as to data pulled from the weather app Dark Sky. And it produces reports that can be downloaded by decision makers. So My Coast is a platform that's a subscription-based website that different states can subscribe to, and doing so, they can create these state-specific flood databases or state-specific websites, which is what Maryland has done. So they've just launched this Maryland My Coast in the fall of 2020, and I've been helping them to roll it out to various communities on the lower shore, which include Deal Island, as well as some other communities slightly up the Chesapeake Bay from there. I'm specifically interested in how this tool could be a mechanism to elevate local voices, to empower local voices in adaptation decision-making, and how that can be integrated into the existing structures designed to shape planning around coastal flooding. And then the last initiative I'm involved in currently is exploring how to replicate a program called Lead the Coast for the Eastern Shore. LEAD is this amazing environmental justice program that's been developed by the Foundation for Louisiana. LEAD stands for Leadership, Education, Advocacy, and Development, and it's a program that's specifically designed to train and to empower community leaders from underserved and disenfranchised communities, with the hopes that they can then better engage in decision-making processes that can improve their circumstances as they're facing ongoing and future coastal changes tied to climate change and other factors. So there's an interest in a number of different practitioner groups who are working on the Eastern Shore and developing a Lead the Coast in order to also be able to better serve underserved rural communities that are located there, and in particular, Black and Brown communities that are on the front lines. So I've been working closely with DNR as well as other groups that are interested in enrolling or creating a Lead the Coast program on the Eastern Shore to define the goals, identify some gaps and needs, and also some opportunities for doing this, for rolling or creating this program for Eastern Shore communities. So I'm looking forward to engaging in these conversations that we're going to have today and sharing more of these various projects and efforts that I've been a part of. So thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Liz. Okay, next we have Michael.
Thanks, Cindy. So Michael Paoliso again. So a bit of background on me. I live in a coastal community that is experiencing flooding, experiencing a rather extensive social and ecological change. I live out on the Deal Island Peninsula that Liz was just referring to. I've lived out here part-time for about 15 years and full-time for almost the last 2 years, and have been doing research out here since around 2000. And this is a very vulnerable community. We have shoreline erosion, and we are actually starting a living shoreline that similar to what Cindy talked about. We have marshes that are migrating inland and perhaps not being replenished. They're also subsiding. We have flooding, roadside flooding, nuisance flooding, some tidal flooding. And so we're quite vulnerable to flooding out here, and it's increasing. On the other hand, there are lots of community resilience, not sufficient for these challenges, but through social networks and relationships out here, there is community resilience to be drawn upon. I'm also one of the co-founders of the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership that Liz was just talking about. You can see a link to that partnership on my profile. We're receiving the Hackenberg Award, which will be a presentation tomorrow on the partnership. And also I think the WAPA presentation mentions our partnership. So it is a partnership that tries to build resilience, socio-ecological resilience through collaborations. I'm also an applied anthropologist. For the last 25 years, I've focused on the Chesapeake Bay region, Mid-Atlantic for my work. And last but not least, I'm a professor of anthropology at the Department of Anthropology at the University of Maryland. So next slide, please. So what work do I do that's related to resilience and adaptation? My longtime interest has been in cultural knowledge of the environment, and I've been interested in cultural models of the environment using approaches from cognitive anthropology, both qualitative and quantitative. A real strong focus and interest in the cultural knowledge, implicit and tacit, that all stakeholders bring to these environmental problems. I'm very interested in the human environmental connections and how they're changing and how they change in systemic ways. And so I'm very interested in socio-ecological systems in coastal areas in particular. A lot of my work and interest has been focused on the cultural natural interactions around natural resource management. Deal Island area is one of the traditional fishing communities, Chesapeake Bay watermen. And so I focus quite a bit on fisheries, marshes recently with Liz, environmental services of marshes, et cetera, and pollution and environment and its effect on natural resources. Since around 2012, a big focus on climate change through the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership. We've done a lot of research on the cultural models of climate change. I see people who are participating in our session today have been involved in that with us, and as well as the climate change physical impacts here that are occurring in the Bay, in particular the Deal Island Peninsula. A central focus has been collaborative learning. I also see people on the participating today who have worked with us on collaborative learning and written guides and on collaborative learning. Collaborative learning is an approach that we've integrated into our ethnography. It's a focus on stakeholders who are addressing environmental problems where there's disagreement and tension, where our goal is to help them learn about each other and the reasons they take their particular positions, and supporting them to have non-judgmental dialogue and engagement, and not necessarily coming to agreement, but coming to enough consensus to be willing to keep working together, and in the process continue to learn about each other. And that's been a central focus of the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership. Lastly, this session is about community resilience and adaptation. I mean, absolutely central that communities participate or engaged, and they have a tremendous stake in it. But I'm also maybe more interested in the multi-level stakeholder networks that link communities to non-governmental organizations, to county and state government. It cannot just be too much focus on community capability and what community do. It has to be a multi-level network, and all stakeholders, all of the people involved in this network are stakeholders. And that's been the focus of the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership. So with that, I'll end and I'll pass it back to Cindy.
Okay, thank you, Michael. All right, and then I'll just provide a brief background of my interest in my research. So I am with the Department of Anthropology and the Coastal Studies Institute at East Carolina University. I'm an applied environmental anthropologist. Most of my work uses an interdisciplinary perspective, and most of it is collaborative work with ecologists, geophysical scientists, economists, really across the board. And that's one of the emphasis in my position with the Coastal Studies Institute is, approaching these coastal problems and issues through an interdisciplinary or transdisciplinary lens. So with that, in terms of my own work and interest in resilience, so I've been at ECU now for about 5 years. Previously, I worked for NOAA Fisheries out in Hawaii. My dissertation research had to do with fishing communities and fisheries management in the US Virgin Islands. So over the past 15 years, I've done a lot of work involving community engagement, resilience, adaptation related to everything from, how fishing regulations impact, islands in the Caribbean where every individual on the island is somehow impacted because of their connection to the marine resources, to the coast. And more recently, the work that I've been doing in North Carolina, which is more relevant today to our conversations, I wanted to highlight 2 projects that are ongoing. One is a project that I'm doing with a couple other social scientists, as well as engineers from ECU. And this is building on a recent effort to deal with extreme flooding that is occurring in the eastern part of North Carolina around the Lake Mattamuskeet area in particular. And for this particular project, we have our engineering partners have student groups or their capstone course in their senior year. Typically they design projects with some or engineering solutions for a particular issue. The idea here, and this was designed pre-COVID, was to really do this in an engaged way and to have the students, their small groups, about 4 students in each, really interact with the community to understand how does the community want to move forward with restoring the watershed, with how they can adapt to and handle the flooding that is occurring in this region. COVID happened, and so we had to shift gears a little bit, and we just have not had the opportunity to provide the students with the same amount of community engagement, but we've done some some virtual focus groups and things like that. But the idea is, you know, how not only to train or to expose the students to community engagement and what that means, especially when it comes to engineering designs for resilience. There's a local and a community-based perspective that is one of the goals of this project, right? So that the students can be exposed to that and can learn from and build on that. So that is one project. Another project I've been working on is with Princeville, North Carolina, which is the oldest town founded in America by Blacks, by freed slaves. And they have been, so they're a little more inland, but they experience riverine flooding. If you've heard of them, you may have heard of them from 1999, the flooding with Hurricane Floyd. That was really the first time that they experienced, or that they received national attention. And then they flooded again in 2016 with Hurricane Matthew. Still going through the rebuilding process. It's been very challenging. You know, low resources, minimal funding that they have. But things are progressing. There's a lot of really amazing things going on now with the community. They have purchased a few pieces of land, well, large parcels of land that are outside of the flood zone. So there's this whole sort of, in a way, managed retreat that's going on, but in a very conscious way to not lose the connection of that unique heritage and culture of the community. But one of the projects that I did recently with them was conducting oral histories and collecting oral histories with long-term residents, really to get the insiders and the community-based perspective of what resilience means to them. You know, so I think there's many theories, many ways to measure resilience and adaptation, you know, but what does it really mean to people who are living in this kind of environment? And, you know, they can't, but also don't want to leave this area because of the importance. So what does resilience actually look like, you know, from their perspective? So, and with that, I will leave that and open it up for some more general discussion. So what I thought is we could, you know, kind of go through these questions one by one. And, you know, we'll give our participants, our panelists, an opportunity to respond. And then we can, you know, open it up for Q&A. And Juno, are you able to provide a little guidance on the mechanics of how that would work, the logistics? Do you want people to type questions in the Q&A? And
so we already have one question in the Q&A. If people want, they can feel free to type in the Q&A and I can read it out to you guys. Or if they want to use the raise hand feature, I can unmute them so that way they can specifically ask.
Okay. Why don't we had hoped to have, you know, sort of some dialogue. So why don't we do the hand raise, and if someone is not comfortable doing that and they prefer to just put their question in the Q&A, then we certainly can address those as well that way. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great.
Okay. All right, so the first question was, what do you believe to be the biggest issue or issues related to coastal community resilience and adaptation to flooding in the Norfolk area? So for those of you who do work in that region or in the region in which you live and work. And of course, I think we all touched on some of these, but it would be great to hear further details. So anyone wants to jump in on our panel?
Cindy, how about I start?
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you.
I think I touched on this a little bit, that here in the Hampton Roads area, not just, Norfolk and beyond, is that part of the challenge that we have in terms of dealing even with kind of the problem and identifying possible trajectories to move forward is that we have 17 different localities. And so one of our biggest challenges is thinking about how do we approach this issue of coastal resilience from a regional perspective. Because the water doesn't respect boundaries. And so while Norfolk and Virginia Beach might be two separate political jurisdictions, the flooding isn't going to completely stop at the boundary between Norfolk and Virginia Beach. But the actions that one city takes has ripple effects on flooding and the resilience of another locality. And so that's something that we've struggled with, is because, the approaches that the localities are taking might not necessarily be completely in sync. And we also have to think about how you respect the different sovereignties, in a sense, of these localities and their ability to make their own decisions, yet thinking about this as a more regional effort that needs some coordination or ways to get them to think a little bit more broadly about the problem.
Thank you. And that's going to beg the question for me of, have you found a way to address that or handle that, the lack or the need to combine sort of efforts and various scales?
So it has been something that I think we've been very cognizant of. And in about 2015, 2016, the White House had actually started kind of a climate change preparedness task force. And so we had created a pilot planning task, kind of initiative here in Hampton Roads as a result of that executive order. And it was really intended to be a way to think about how do we get the region as a whole to think about coastal adaptation and resilience more broadly, sea level rise mitigation and preparedness. And so really thinking about it from a whole of government perspective. We have multiple federal installations here that, the planning for DOD stops at the federal boundary. So thinking about how do we get a whole of government with federal, state, local government agencies involved, but also whole of community, residents, businesses, nonprofits, and across the region, not just one particular locality. So it was a good starting point. I think made quite a bit of headways, but it was a 2-year pilot that I think kind of built some momentum, but I don't know that we've necessarily solved the problem.
Sure.
So I can build on that a little bit because the regional aspect is huge, right? Like, and not only just in the permitting and the regulation, but some of the things that we've been thinking about and asking questions about is what are the regional consequences of local action? So say a homeowner protects their shoreline, how does that affect adjacent ones? And how does that affect even further afield? There's been a lot of work in San Francisco Bay that shows that when you protect shorelines in one place, you affect how the tide comes in. And so that affects flooding somewhere else, which then floods highways and all of that sort of thing. And there just aren't many studies out there yet about that broader regional scale from the science side, as well as how do you deal with that in a policy in that situation. And the other thing that I hear often from the management agencies is that property owners can be reluctant to put in protection measures that they're not quite sure are going to like work over the long term. And so having long-term data that can show, like, we put in a shoreline here, this is what happened, this is what you can expect, is surprisingly there's not too many of those. And some of that has to do with the way that funding works, that studies aren't often funded for long-term, but just providing more like hard numbers behind it, I think would be helpful.
We have some attendees that have raised their hands.
Okay.
Yes, hi. My name is Jana Kopolentova-Rihak, and I am environmental anthropologist. I teach for University of Maryland, and I have been working last 10 years on a Smith Island. And I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about local knowledge and management of the land, because something that I see on the island, on Smith Island, is that the community like Smith Island have their traditional kind of a long-term ways of managing their land. And so they are trying to apply that now to much more rapid flooding than in past, but nonetheless, historically, they have always managed their land. So they never lived on this just given island, but they had ways to control coastlines in the past. And I was wondering if any of you on the panel could talk about maybe some specific locally determined traditions in protecting coastlines.
I can just add a few comments, Jana. Traditionally, and Deal Island's close to Smith Island, as you know, people didn't live along the shoreline, and for the reasons of storms and shoreline erosion. And historically, all the watermen and their families moved as far inland as they could, close to the shoreline. So their method of adaptation to eroding shorelines was to stay away from the shorelines. And there was also this understanding, and still is, that islands shift and evolve and move, and you need to adapt to that. People do recognize now that many of these islands, Smith Island's still an exception to this, come here as people have moved into these communities and purchased shoreline property and put down riprap and harden them, and they're somewhat protecting the shoreline. So I think traditionally, in the sense of shoreline erosion, people have had this understanding that islands shift and move and islands disappear, and Holland Island in the Chesapeake Bay is a good example. And their adaptation was to stay away from the shoreline. And now they recognize that they need something in addition to that, and that's where I sense the living shoreline is. So I think traditional knowledge is very useful to a point, but the problems that they're facing are beyond often what those traditional knowledges and practices can deal with right now.
Anyone else on the panel have a response to Jana's question or about sort of traditional approaches?
I guess I can add a thought to what Michael just said, and that is how important faith-based knowledge is for a lot of people who live in these rural areas like Deal Island, Smith Island as well, and other highly isolated rural communities like these. Their faith traditions have been an adaptation strategy for a lot of these communities, and an important one for helping them be very adaptive and flexible and kind of go with the flow. And I do think that we've got a lot of hard work in figuring out how to kind of bridge these conversations around climate science and faith, particularly these more conservative faith views that may, for political reasons, be and for other reasons be highly skeptical or unwilling to engage in that conversation. And I think if we're gonna bring groups together in collaborative ways, we need to make more room for both to be at the table, and even if we agree to disagree, I think it's important that those various perspectives are together at the table and have a voice. But I do think that's an important traditional form of knowledge that has always helped these communities get through hard times, and it continues to be a source of their resilience, and I imagine it will be, but they also are going to need science and other tools to help them navigate these changes in the future.
Thank you for responding. I just want to say, I don't know if you can hear me now, if I'm muted or not.
We can hear you.
Yeah, I just want to say it's interesting because it's slightly different on a Smith Island in a sense that they, for example, have a say keeping up with the waterfront, which means that you have your waterfront is your front yard. And just like on the mainland, we are kind of obligated to cut our grass as a kind of moral, ethical obligation to our neighbors and community, in a sense, in some of the US communities. On a Smith Island, the obligation to keep up with your waterfront is part of daily, weekly, annual. It's just something that people are expected to care for and do because there is no place to move. You know, on the island, it's much more restricted. So people, yeah, part of life is to constantly observe and watch my front line. That's waterfront line. That's just something that I have observed is part of way of being on the island. And I thought it's interesting contrast to what Michael said about this moving way from physically. The Smith Islanders are much more fixed in that sense. But thank you for responding.
Yeah, thank you for your question.
I wanted to come back to your question number one here about the biggest issues related to coastal community resilience, and just add this to the conversation. I see one of the big barriers is that we have groups that are working on coastal resilience to flooding who think very differently about what that means from how maybe a lot of communities are thinking about it. I'll give an example from Deal Island. I think that you know, a lot of times these coastal resilience conversations are very focused on the physical changes that are happening to the landscape, and that's very important. But a lot of watermen that I've talked to frame their I'll flip it, their vulnerability in terms of disempowerment. And I think empowerment or disempowerment agency is very much part of what shapes people's resilience from a community resilience point of view. But that focus on the social dimensions that shape people's adaptive capacity is not at the forefront of how we're framing or talking about resilience to flooding in a lot of our sort of broader regional conversations. It tends to be very focused on the physical environmental change and less on the kind of social landscapes that shape people's agency, or that leave them feeling quite disempowered to have their voice heard or to be a part of these conversations. And so I think that's a really big need here, is how do we to find ways to bridge that gap. And I see a lot of, I think that gap exists a lot within our institutions. And so how do we create more institutional space for these other forms of resilience that are equally as important to dealing with flooding and adapting to flooding as is addressing the actual physical vulnerability of sea level rise.
And Cindy, if I could connect to that real briefly.
Please.
So for example, if we take the issue of living shorelines, for example, you know, one of the challenges that we have here in Virginia is obviously we're not meeting our no net loss of wetlands goal because property owners are still reverting to kind of the expectations for armored solutions, bulkheads, revetment, rather than going the route of living shorelines. And so as a policy scholar, then I have to step back and say, okay, so we have policy, we have legislation that says living shorelines are the preferred approach. Yet at the implementation level, property owners are going the opposite route still. I mean, we're seeing some progress on living shorelines, but there's a tendency to do what my neighbors are doing or to do what's already in place, which are the harder solutions. And so there's a break between the policy and the actual action, which sometimes goes to this issue of efficacy. Sometimes it's the question that Cindy raised about, are living shorelines really effective? But the other goes to property owners not knowing what is the right route for them to go in terms of the right solutions to manage erosion on their property. So there's that efficacy and that agency that also comes from not knowing what is the right thing to do, but also how much of this is within my control and how much can I do, how much will one property make a difference? So that is something that I think, there is that disconnect because the policy is well-intentioned, but doesn't necessarily deal with the issues on the ground that property owners are dealing with, or that the fact that at least in the coastal Virginia area that we've been doing work, there are not a lot of contractors who are equipped to help property owners make decisions about constructing living shorelines. They are very well versed on bulkheads and riprap revetment. So there is that breakdown between the policy, I think, and some of the issues that prevent people from actually doing, taking the right actions, not necessarily because they're not well intentioned, but because they don't know what they need to know, or they don't even know where to start taking action.
Could I also add to this first question before we move on?
Yeah.
I think too, it's something that maybe like all of our work has touched on at one point or another is this component of like equity and thinking about people in environmental spaces, and that equity is oftentimes not at the center of these resilience and adaptation conversations and planning. And these resilience conversations oftentimes happen in the context of ecological resilience and emphasizing physical vulnerability to flooding, which is good and great, it's important. But I think when we start to focus too much on, and I think it happens when we focus too much on where does it make the most sense to protect and where does it make the most sense to move people out in our work, in adaptation work, we are at a really precarious line of perpetuating issues of inequality when equity is not at the center of a lot of our adaptation conversations. And I think adaptation work has the potential to increase equity exponentially, but I think also if it's not sort of intentionally worked into the things we're doing and the way we're approaching adaptation, it can also perpetuate these issues. And I just think that's a really important issue that probably all of us have encountered at some point or another.
Absolutely. And that, I think we're discussing all four questions at the same time, which is fantastic, which means it's all connected. So, yeah, so maybe building on that, or maybe we can look at question 2 in terms of an interdisciplinary approach. I mean, I think we've all mentioned this in one way or another, but this idea that it's not just ecological resilience or the physical resilience, right? It's these social, ecological, physical, natural systems, right? Connections and have any of you, or what have you found in your experiences in your work that that's been successful to sort of take this this multiple perspective approach to it, or an interdisciplinary approach to trying to solve some of these issues or address these issues?
I'll just say from the Deal Island Peninsula Partnership perspective, Michael covered this very nicely already, but we've drawn heavily upon collaborative learning, and we found this to be a very effective tool for facilitating interdisciplinary work across disciplines, but also knowledge types. And so I think that it's been a really useful tool for increasing knowledge sharing and creating more equitable space for different people to be part of these conversations, and also has helped us develop rapport between people who don't have a lot of experience working with one another. And through that, we're able to build some trust and also open up some space for having those harder conversations about, we haven't approached managed retreat yet, but it could end up leading to pathways to having some very heart-to-heart conversations about how we tackle this together. And I think that's really valuable. I will say this maybe speaks to some of the other questions here, but it takes a lot of work and it takes mechanisms to sustain it. And that's where we hit roadblocks, is that we, you have to have the mechanisms to keep this going. And I think that as the social scientists, the anthropologists involved in the Deal Island Peninsula Project who've been leading the collaborative learning process, we've been able to keep it going. But once Michael moves on and once I move on, there's no one to kind of carry that torch right now. And so how do you keep this kind of interdisciplinary dialogue going? That's something that we're trying to work out right now. And I think it's a challenge that we'll all be faced with in doing our interdisciplinary work. And one more thing I'll add to that, and this again gets to the institutional challenges. There isn't a lot, from my perspective, at least working in this region, there isn't as much space within the institutions for social science work to the extent that I would like to see it be part of these conversations. And I think there needs to be getting at the point that way you raised in your presentation, that this has to be really human-led. And I think that's the role of social scientists, is to help do that work. And so there needs to be more space for social science research within this broader conversation of how we build coastal resilience to flooding.
And if I could piggyback on that, I love technology. I love that we can do all kinds of cool maps and we can create all kinds of cool apps. But one of my biggest pet peeves has been this, well, we'll create an app for that and people will use it. Rather than thinking about putting people at the center of the problem and saying, okay, what are people struggling with? And what solutions do they need? And we design the technological solution to that need. And this is where I think that interdisciplinary approach is really, really critical. One of the earliest projects that I remember starting here in the region when I first started getting into this issue of flooding is trying to better understand how drivers respond to flooding on the roads. Because as a lot of the people here in Norfolk will tell you, if we all follow the National Weather Service's turn around, don't drown, we're never going to get anywhere. We're not going to get out of our neighborhood on a rainy day. So what is so people are adapting to flooding by having their own decision rules about flooding on the roads. But without knowing what those decision rules are, we can't say, yes, let's use Waze and create a flood indicator or a flood alert on Waze without understanding how people are looking and thinking about flooding while they're driving or anticipating driving. But while my team was doing all of this underpinning research, we had 3 or 4 teams of private companies and innovators out there saying, oh, we're going to design this flood app. But they couldn't seem to connect with our team and trying to figure out how do we merge their tech savviness with our human people savviness. And I think an interdisciplinary approach where that is embedded helps make that critical connection. And so that's something I think that I always struggle with. Oh yeah, we have the technology to do it. Let's do it. But if we don't really know why people would want to use it and how they would use it, can we really be effective in finding the right solutions or building the right app or the right, story map or technology, whatever that solution is, without recognizing the user, the person, right, who would use the phone or who would go to the story map. And so that's, I think, one thing that I'm hopeful that more interdisciplinary approaches can help us better address.
It's a really great point, and I'll just say that I've experienced this frustration in trying to help DNR roll out My Coast, because it's the same thing. They've produced this app, which is great. It's a really fantastic app, but people aren't using it, and nobody, they didn't do the groundwork ahead of time to understand how to make this most effective. I don't mean to be critical of them because they have limited capacity too, but there's a real interest in getting county governments to use this tool, and the county government folks that I've spoken with are just expecting people to pick this up once they, put Facebook posts out there about My Coast, and people aren't using it. It's not part of their daily practice. It's not on the forefront of their mind. It needs some coordination and some local collaboration to really make those linkages so that this technology, this really great app that they've got, can actually be useful to people. How there's no plan in place right now, for example, to use the data to go to communities and talk about what it's finding and what solutions might be helpful going forward. There needs to be more of that sort of forethought given to how to use these kinds of tools. And I think that the interdisciplinary approach, bringing in some of the expertise with the human dimensions perspectives, the behavior understandings, can really help to guide using these kinds of technologies in more productive ways. So I appreciate that point, Wei.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Maybe I'll just add a quick comment. We've that human dimension, that human centeredness that we talked about, and Liz, in Deal Island Peninsula Partnership, we have built these relationships through multidisciplinary collaborations. And at the individual level, all of our stakeholders are very, very supportive, whether they're a marine scientist, a marsh ecologist, or an anthropologist. The main obstacle that we still struggle with in this interdisciplinary approach is having someone who is specifically charged to make sure that the human-centered focus is being addressed constantly within our partner organizations, and less so at the community, where there is quite a bit of human-centered focus. So we made a recommendation, one of our projects, that county government needed to hire a community liaison to work with communities on this issue of flooding, because otherwise it gets lost in the institutional shuffle, despite the best interest of the individuals who are engaged in the collaborative learning process. So that interdisciplinary, it needs an institutional position within the agencies to help sustain it and get it into the policy and programming of government and non-government agencies at different levels.
I was just going to add to that is, so this interdisciplinary approach is one of the goals of the Research Coordination Network, funded by the National Science Foundation's Coastlines and People program. And so it's intentionally bringing physical scientists and social scientists together. Like a lot of things, there's not a whole lot of funding there. So it's more just starting the dialogue, which it's the first time that I've really been intentionally involved in these kinds of dialogues. And as a scientist, I found it really helpful and eye-opening and just really great. And I really hope it's just the first step in doing this kind of work that integrates the human dimensions along with the physical science. So that's something that we're starting to do a lot more, because as we was mentioning, you can have all the science behind these things in the world, which we don't quite have yet. But say in a perfect world we get there, like we need to cross that divide. And so working together, I think, helps us try to figure out like what are the problems that folks are experiencing along the coastline, and then how can we work together to try to, I won't say solve, because I don't feel like we ever solve problems, but we can address those problems in a way that might be sustainable for everyone, or at least a step towards that for everyone.
Yeah, so I think we have another hand raised. Do we want to take another question from our participants?
And just can I also say that people have been adding questions to the Q&A that I've answered a few just from my perspective. So others feel free to comment as well.
Yeah, I think it'd be good to maybe also look at those questions and maybe slip a couple in.
Okay.
Amanda Stoltz, you're unmuted if you would like to ask your question.
Great, thank you. Yeah, can everyone hear me?
Yep.
Awesome. So I'm a PhD student at UC Santa Cruz, and I study managed retreat and coastal resilience and have been for several years. And I'm wondering, when we talk about coastal resilience, and across all of your intros and everything we've talked about, it's come up as social resilience and physical resilience in the face of coastal change and sea level rise. But I'm wondering, what does resilience mean for some of these low-lying areas that like living shorelines are not going to protect when we look, 50 years into the future with the projected sea level rise that we're looking at. So I was just wondering, when we think about the term resilience, what does that mean, especially in areas where managed retreat might be the only option?
I also am am a fan, or it keeps me up at night, the topic of managed retreat, so I can take a stab. I think especially thinking about sort of the mid-Atlantic, like we have a lot of low-lying areas, right? So, and I think in a lot of these places, identity is tied to place, and living by the water, and living by the bay. But I don't think that resilience necessarily needs to be place-based, right? Resilience means the ability to come back and ideally thrive in the face of impacts. And so I think, going back to what Liz was saying, if we're able to give people as many resources and feelings of empowerment and autonomy and respect as much as we do our marshes and these processes, I think resilience in places where managed retreat is likely to happen socially can be a thing. And I think increasing resilience in these areas is about investing in communities, not just in managed retreat efforts, but outside of that, and making people more socially resilient. So whether that be jobs or education or in things that matter to communities, I think having communities drive the managed retreat discussions and also sort of define what increased resilience means to them. So does that mean moving at a household level or at a community level, or what kind of environmental features are important to people in the places that they want to go? I think people in low-lying areas eventually will have to relocate at some point, if it's bad enough. And I think there is ways to build or to be resilient in the face of change where managed retreat is necessary, but I think it needs to be done really intentionally, because I think that the typical sort of ways to go about buyouts and these kinds of processes don't necessarily promote resilience.
Yeah, and I can add to that. So, I mentioned this project that I've been working on with the town of Princeville, and it was a really eye-opening and interesting project because, as an outsider, I mean, I'm not from this community. I have certain not expectations, but certain ideas of what resilience is and means, right? Especially as someone at a university who's, teaching theory, et cetera. And so what was really interesting with the oral histories and with these interviews is, so especially with the population that, marginalized African-American population, rural, high poverty level, and yet this really rich heritage and cultural, importance of the community. But I remember this one gentleman just saying, we don't call it resilience, we just live it. They have had to be resilient for years and years, regardless of the flooding. And this was the only land that they could have, right, as freed slaves. So it's not resilience to them. It's just, they're not leaving, and they don't have a choice but to remain. And, what they're doing now, I mentioned that they have these 2 additional parcels of land that they've acquired. And, so what, from, again, sort of an outsider perspective, they're really doing a very strategic managed retreat, or partial managed retreat anyway, right? Where they are, to the extent that they can leave some of the important historic places, even, I think there's only a couple at this point, structures, but to the extent that they can make those flood-proof and resilient, that they can stay in the original places. And they're developing green spaces for previously bought up properties, but really trying to, to redevelop the area that floods primarily in a flood-proof way, right, or in a more resilient way. But then relocating some of the things like the really critical infrastructure out of that floodplain. Because especially the older part of the population, to them, if you're not, in Princeville, you're not in Princeville, right? And so it's a very intentional, I like that you said that, Andrea, a very intentional process, right? To figure out how do we keep that connection, but still, adapt, right, to this continued issue of flooding.
Thanks, Cindy and Andrea. I think that really answered, you both answered the question in different ways, and I thought that was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you for your question. Should we, let's see, well, we're down to about 10 minutes. Should we take maybe one other question and then do a little bit of a wrap up?
I think so. And Juno, can you confirm if we have a meetup after this scheduled?
You guys do, at least as far as I am aware. I am not certain of what the meetup number is.
Okay.
But as far as I'm aware, you guys should have a Hoover meetup, and here your moderator for that is Shannon Cronin. Right here.
Okay.
Okay, so I did see, I believe Shirley Fisk had her hand up and has typed a question in as well. So maybe we can take one last question from her.
Yep, and I just unmuted her.
Okay.
Oh, thanks. Can you hear me?
Yep.
I just wanted to add to the comments that Cindy, Grace McCaskey was saying about Princeville. I think on the Lower Eastern Shore, there are many communities that are similar in the sense that they were established by emancipated or freed Blacks after emancipation. I think Michael has worked on this, and Christine Miller Hesed, and I mean the critical thing for their quote adaptation, the things that they really care about are when their homes are being flooded, the creeks are rising, as they say, and their churches. The churches are the center stone for the community, the graveyards, and there's very little. I don't know if any of them have actually been raised, that is the buildings, and whether the graveyards have been, I don't know how you would protect those. Maybe Michael, you might have some comments having, or Liz, you might have some comments having worked with these communities on the Lower Eastern Shore. But I think they have a lot in common with Princeville, probably.
Yeah, Michael here. We had a NOAA-funded project that looked at the role of churches as being community and organizations, institutions that can bridge between communities and county and government agencies. That project included African-American churches, and we continue to work with them. These churches and the communities that surround them are more times than not in the most vulnerable areas to flooding and have the fewest amount of resources available to them, and are quite invisible because many of the members have moved away and these churches are extremely small, yet there's still a sense of place, and people still come back to the church even though they've moved away. So it's a real need, a high need community that getting visibility. And we've worked with one church on trying to protect their cemetery, and a tremendous amount of effort has gone into it, and they've had some success in being able to actually do things, but then we run into problems with regulations and permitting. So the challenges that all the coastal communities are facing, I think, are even felt even more strongly in by the African American communities and the churches.
Thank you. Thanks, Michael.
I'll just add that I think, and we've all mentioned this already, but that invisibility piece is a real important point. And it's, I think, the experience of a lot of these African-American communities that are living in these low-lying areas. They're wanting to save these places like their churches and their cemeteries, but they don't have a mechanism to have their voice heard, let alone listened to. And creating those pathways for them to have a seat at the table is absolutely critical. And right now we don't have the mechanism to do that. And Michael mentioned that in our research, we've come up with the recommendation of community liaisons. And that's something that we've reiterated over and over again. And I'll just add that I think these need to be paid positions to help legitimize those voices and those perspectives. And, as is every other adaptation practitioner out there, who's paid to have a job and to represent these perspectives. These community liaisons need to also be paid to be at the table as well, largely because they're already very stretched thin in terms of their ability to dedicate time and energy to these issues on top of their daily needs or meeting their daily needs. So yeah, I just wanted to add that point in there again too.
Thank you.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Shirley.
Okay, thank you.
All right, well, I think we only have about 5 minutes left. If anybody on the panel has any sort of closing comments or statements, we can just go around the room, so to speak. I have Liz on the top of my screen here. I'll call on you.
I just really enjoyed this session today. I think that everybody had really great things to add to this conversation, and I hope that we all can continue this discussion about how to support coastal community resilience to flooding, particularly as that issue becomes more and more problematic for more communities. But I do think that, you know, our point about creating mechanisms to keep doing that interdisciplinary work and to sustain that work is really critical. So I think that was one of the points that that really resonated with me today.
Thank you. I see Cindy next on my screen here.
All right. I totally agree with Liz. Yeah, so this has been great. As I mentioned at the start, this is my first time at an anthropology conference, and it's really great. And I think that more of this this connection between the social science and the physical science is really needed to move these issues forward. And so I really look forward to kind of exploring around and seeing what else is happening at this conference around coastal resilience. I found a whole bunch of really interesting stuff already. And so I think this is definitely a conversation that needs to continue. And to Liz's point, like we also need to find ways to fund these efforts so that we can continue to work productively and do these kind of collaborations, which can sometimes be really challenging to find a funding mechanism. So finding those and making the point to the funders that these types of collaborations are really valuable, I think is really important going forward. So thank you for allowing me to be with you all today. This has been great.
Thank you. All right, I have we next on my screen.
Thanks, Cindy. I think I would, for me, I think I wanted to reiterate kind of the importance of the people-centered approach, but also to highlight the challenges with that. So particularly when we try to work with stakeholders or with residents, yes, as a researcher, flooding is a critical issue for me, but I also recognize that a lot of our homeowners, a lot of our residents have other priorities: education, transportation, childcare. So how can I help them engage with this issue in a way that can resonate with them? You know, that meets them where they are. And so I think we've also had to recognize the need to be more innovative and creative in how we engage. And so one of the things, for example, is my team developed this action-oriented stakeholder engagement for a resilient tomorrow, ASSERT approach. And with ASSERT, we intentionally embedded gamification and social learning because we didn't want to just have people come to another public meeting. We try to build in elements that would motivate people to learn from themselves, from each other, to learn from, you know, city stakeholders, and thinking about how we motivate them in an environment that was friendly. So not going into kind of, you know, hostile territory, and making it a way that they felt like they could engage at some level with city decision makers that had information that they didn't have. And so we had to be very creative because just getting people to come to something is enough of a struggle. And then they start talking about flooding, and there's so much, you know, personal history, there's so much anxiety about loss and damage and fear about flood insurance rates, that we really tried to use gamification as a way to reduce the tension and the anxiety kind of inherent in kind of these types of issues. So I think we've had to recognize that we needed to be approach this very differently than what we would traditionally do working with localities in terms of holding your standard public meeting. That's just not going to work. You're not going to get people to come out unless they're really, really angry about a particular issue or really, really invested. And so I think for us, we really, as we developed our ASSERT model, really had to think about how do we encourage that learning and how do we encourage the motivation to get people to engage.
Absolutely. Andrea?
I just want to say, as an early career academic, environmental something anthropologist, maybe, I'm just really happy to have sat on this panel with you all. It was really informative and interesting. And my only closing thoughts are to echo Liz. I think paying liaisons and community experts for their time and amplifying their voices and knowledge, especially for groups that have been marginalized historically, is really important if we want our approaches to adaptation and resilience to be more effective and more equitable, which I think is the most important thing.
Great. Michael?
Lots have been said, so I don't have to read better than I could say it. I'll add one point. When I was thinking of community liaisons, I was thinking of paid positions, career tracks within these organizations. So I'll even take it that far, because you need somebody who knows the inside lay of the organization, that they can have as their scope of work, how do we make this human-centered community at the forefront? Not the forefront, but you know, not just integrated, but kind of framing it. So I'll just end there and thank you. I think, you know, I've enjoyed it, and thank everyone for participating. And that's for me.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed this. It's a shame that it wasn't in person, but maybe we can continue it next year. And thank you very much for your time and for those who attended. And if anyone has questions that we didn't get to or further comments, please, you know, reach out to us. I will be around for the whole week, really. So.
Yeah, Cynthia, and also Juno on the Hoover Meetup. Do you have any guidance for Juno on that? If Juno's still on.
So as far as I can tell, you guys do have a Hoover Meetup. I'm not certain what exactly the extent is of how long that can go. But when I go on to the Society for Applied Anthropology annual conference site, you guys do have a Hoover that's available to you guys if anyone wants to join on there to continue asking questions or answering.
Okay. So my suggestion is that, and Cindy, you also what you think, you know, if people want to check in to see if there's some more conversation, we can just do that and see if anyone wants to talk a little bit more. But I leave it up to people on the panel. You know, I know you have other things to do as well, other sessions.
I mean, I'm happy to go over there, but don't need to either necessarily.
Okay.
Same.
Great. So, well, as co-chair, I want to thank everyone. This is, you know, the first day of our virtual meeting, one of our first critical conversations. I thought we had a really good discussion, and I think it went pretty well. So I'm relieved. And so maybe I'll see some of you over in the meetup, but I know I'll see you later on in the meeting as well. So from my side, thank you very much.
Yep, thank you. And thank you to Juno for helping us out as well.
Yeah.
Yes, thank you. It's a wonderful panel. I hope you guys all have a wonderful day.
Thanks. Okay, I'll see you all. I'm signing off and moving into Hoover. Okay.
Okay.
Thanks. Bye.